Mary Pickford, America's sweetheart, died May 29, 1979, at approximately 2 o'clock in the afternoon at the Santa Monica Hospital from a stroke that she had suffered just 4 days prior under the care of Dr. Lester Lorian. Mary's memorial would take place May 31st at the Wee Kirk o' the Heather Church at Forest Lawn in Glendale. It was a very private funeral which had been requested by the star who was once the most famous in the world. Now, just prior to her memorial, on the same day, Mary was cremated at Live Oak Crematorium in Monrovia, California, as it was stated on her death certificate. Gates, Kingsley, and Gates were listed on this death certificate as the funeral directors. In our collection, we actually have one of the original memorial programs. Because we have this program, it tells us the story that the service was conducted by Dr. William H.D. Hornaday of Founders United Church of Religious Science in Los Angeles. Mary had an honor guard by the Naval Sea Cadets. The organist was Dr. R. Donald Curry, and Dr. Curry played Mary, My Buddy, Let Me Call You Sweetheart, and Unforgettable, along with a violin solo by Rima Medina. The eulogy was given by Mary's cousin, John Mantley. We are very fortunate to have this eulogy in our collection, so if you stick around to the end of this video, we'll read that for you. Also in our collection, we have an original press photo of two of the guests that attended this very private ceremony. One was Mary's longtime close friend, Lillian Gish, and Mary's stepson, Douglas Fairbanks Jr. And you can actually narrow in on this photo and see the entrance to the front of the church that we can compare and match up in this video. We also have an original photograph of a somber but very handsome Buddy Rogers leaving the service. This photograph was taken by one of his close friends, Don Schneider. Much like the remaining years of Mary's life, her memorial was very private. Mary was interred in the family plot in the Garden of Memory at Forest Lawn. Though a key is required to enter the garden, fans of the Pickford family are drawn to the images of beautiful sarcophagus and the history that is interred in it. The beautiful garden was not the first area where the Pickford family was interred. When Charlotte, mother of Mary, Lottie, and Jack, passed away in 1928 to breast cancer, 5 crypts were purchased in the Great Mausoleum, Dahlia Corridor location by Mary Pickford herself. In 1931, Finley Benson, who had married Mary's cousin Mabel, died and was interred in one of the family crypts right below Charlotte, and then Jack would soon take another crypt in 1933. Mary's aunt, who was the mother to Mabel and Verna, was interred in 1935, and then lastly, Lottie, Mary's sister, who died in 1936. It was also contracted that Mary would have flowers placed twice a week on the crypts of Charlotte, Jack, and Lottie. Now, by 1940, Mary knew that since the Pickford section was being offered to extended family and friends, a larger plot was needed. With thanks to the Margaret Herrick Library and the Pickford Special Collection, there are actually correspondence that take place between Mary and Forest Lawn that tells us some of these stories. At the time, Forest Lawn had offered Mary 2 options. First option was to acquire a family room within the Great Mausoleum, just a few steps down from the current location. This, at first, was the best option because Mary was very reluctant to move her family. This way, the room would be in view of these other memorials. The room offered 8 more interments, 6 of which were couch crypts, and the other 2 crypts would be located under the floor. The room was adorned by one of the most beautiful stained glass windows in the Forest Lawn, called the Good Shepherd, by Italian artist Antonio Bassiti. In 1940, the room was offered for $27,500. Now, the second option was a garden plot with a statue in the Sweet Memories section. In 1947, Forest Lawn reached out to Mary again, informing her that the new Gardens of Memory was being made available. Even at that time, these gardens had all privacy and permanence as the mausoleum did. Mary was still too busy at that point in New York, and she couldn't have the time to make the changes. However, when Mary's cousin Verna died in 1948, Mary purchased the Gardens of Memory plot where Verna was interred, and then the rest of the family was moved. The garden, the crypt removals, and the sarcophagus had a total cost of $48,222. Very little in these Forest Lawn correspondence discuss anything about the history of the sarcophagus at the Pickford plot or why they chose it. However, in a 1944 Forest Lawn souvenir book that we have in our collection, I was able to find a little more information. The sarcophagus was originally located outside the Great Mausoleum where Jean Hirschfeld's sarcophagus is now. The Pickford sarcophagus is called Motherhood. Forest Lawn's description of the sculpture states, "The boundless power of God to create and to sustain life throughout eternity is nowhere more forcibly expressed at Forest Lawn than in Motherhood, a famous original sculpture by Silva Silva. Into this group had been carved a powerful message of immortality. It depicts motherhood as the eternal fountain from which all earthly existence flows, the trees, flowers, birds, creatures of the field, and man created in the likeness of God. The tipped shell, spilling forth its bounty, symbolizes not only the unselfish love of a mother for her children, but also the infinite love of the great Creator for all mankind." With the sarcophagus now in the family garden, there is 22 interment possibilities, 11 crypts in the sarcophagus, and 11 under the grass plot. Mary's cousin Mabel was interred in the sarcophagus in 1953. Mary's friends Ivan, who passed away in 1953, and his wife Vera, who died in 1988, were buried in the grass plot next to an assistant of Mary's, Ada Erickson, who passed away in 1963. There was even discussion that when Ford Sterling's widow was dying, that possibly she could be buried in the Pickford plot since there was space. However, she ended up elsewhere. Buddy Rogers was not interred, unfortunately, in the sarcophagus, even though there was a crypt space for him, but rather he was interred with his last wife in Forest Lawn Memorial Park of Cathedral City, California. The only Pickford family member that is not interred in the family garden plot is Mary's niece and Lottie's only daughter, Gwen. Gwen is actually interred with her husband in the Great Mausoleum in a bridge corridor that connects over to Holly Terrace. Mary Pickford's Eulogy by John Mantley. What can one say about a legend that has not already been said? Kings and emperors plied her with lavish gifts, princes vied for the honor of being invited to her home, and the world took her to its heart in a way that no other performer has ever known, or ever will know. She was not, you see, a legendary figure from the past, about whom one can only read in books. Nor was she a queen in a gilded carriage waving a hand at her subjects. She was a living, breathing, vibrant, exciting woman and actress with whom half the world has laughed and cried and loved. They could remember her with a tear coursing down her cheek as she mourned over the body of a pet mouse. They could remember her clenching her tiny hands into fists and forcing her face into a fierce scowl of determination as she faced the town bully, and, with golden curls flying, whipped him soundly. And when she did, half the world roared in triumph. She belonged to them, you see. She was to them all that was pure, clean, and good in the human spirit. She belonged to them as she belonged to us. And now, rightfully, and in God's good time, she belongs to the ages. For anyone but Mary, that may seem trite phrase, but with her, it could not be more apt. For in generations to come, students of film in all the universities of the world will learn that the first performer to teach studios and executives the extraordinary value of extraordinary talent, the first performer to have her own production company, was a tiny wisp of a girl, barely 5 feet tall, but with the courage, stamina, dedication, and the shining talent of a giant. I would like to share with you one more brief image. When I learned of her passing, I had the same shock as all of you that Mary was gone. I picked up a little book she had written and given to me called Why Not Try God? And as I leafed through its pages, I said a short prayer. I said, "Dear God, please hold this very special lady in the palm of your hands." And perhaps because I trained to think in visual images, I saw Mary standing in God's upturned palm, young again, with golden curls she had in Tess of the Storm Country, eyes shining with excitement of youth, and I saw God looking down at her with a twinkle in his eyes. Because I cannot conceive a God without a sense of humor, it is the most precious of all the gifts he has bestowed to mankind. I hear him say, "Mary Pickford, show me why, among all the teeming multitudes of my earth, you were so beloved by so many people." I saw Mary as she heard the challenge, accept it, as she accepted every challenge that life presented her. I saw an answering smile on her lips. I watched her place one tiny foot to the left and the other to the right of the line that ran in a semicircle between the thumb and forefinger of his palm. And I saw her put her arms akimbo and toss her golden curls and cock her head at the jaunty angle we have all seen hundreds of times. And I saw that gleam of mischief come into her eyes as she began to work her special and edifying magic. I cannot hear what she said, but suddenly I heard God's deep and resonant and joyful laughter pealing through the vaults of heaven, and I knew that Gladys Smith, Mary Pickford, America's sweetheart, Mrs. Charles Buddy Rogers, had come home.